Welcome back to the second part of Murder with Friends. Today we're talking about H.H. Holmes, and where you're picking up with us, it's what you came to see and hear about. We're gonna be talking about the alleged murder hotel, but first, let's take a look at this element from Rick Strom, who works at TYT Sports, to hear a little bit more about what maybe you already know about.
Holmes's hotel, or murder castle, as it would later be called, was one of his greatest cons. The History Channel reports, the space featured soundproof rooms, secret passages, and a disorienting maze of hallways and staircases. The rooms were also outfitted with trapdoors over chutes that dropped Holmes's unsuspecting victims to the building's basement. The basement was a macabre facility of acid vats, pits of quicklime, often used on decaying corpses, and a crematorium, which the killer used to finish off his victims.
So yeah.
I saw that History Channel show too.
So, but not, yes, it's like you hear things and you're like, yes, but not exactly. Kind of.
Well, yeah, this is a classic sort of like, once you've decided on this narrative, then you just have to kind of keep building on it. So the Hearst papers pay him $7,500 for his confession, which is something like, it's a 6 figures now.
Yes.
And suddenly he's got 200 victims because 9 isn't interesting enough. And then it's not just a hotel, it's a murder hotel with secret compartments and a quicklime and a crematorium. And it's like, it's sort of like if you have some regular person who we've decided, okay, you're this terrible killer, that person's garden shed now becomes the unholy horror garden shed.
Okay, yes. However, he did have a very weirdly outfitted and designed a building that was in the names, that the owners were named by a number of different people, so that when creditors would come to him and say, you haven't paid for this or you haven't paid for that, he could say, well, I don't even own the building anymore, it's this person. And he would get these unwitting people who maybe didn't have the business savvy that they should have. And he's, again, a very smooth con artist, would just be none the wiser about what was happening and why their credit was so bad. I don't even know if they had credit scores back then. But he used this hotel and he did design it for a purpose. And I think that part of it did end up being to get away with killing people and making people disappear. But what did you guys find out about the truth of the murder hotel?
Well, I think going with what you're saying, he probably did have a dream. He envisioned this glorious, torture chamber. I'm sure he probably did. He probably thought, yes, I will have these greased chutes that I will put people in and gas jets in the room and, corridors to nowhere and, my favorite, the elasticity determinator.
What's that?
A torture rack.
Oh, go.
Yeah.
Stretchy.
And it will always determine that people are not that elastic.
Correct. And so, what I have, learned is that, they found a table in the basement, and well, that becomes the operating theater.
Yes.
And again, going back to what Alonso said, this becomes a lot about, the tabloid journalism at the time. They find bones and ashes. Some of those bones, they didn't even know if they were human bones.
But what's crazy is that 10 years, I think it's something like 10 years after Holmes would be hung, they would have developed the science that would have been able to determine more about the remains that were found in his basement. But at this time, they just weren't even to tell if they were human, which I think is really important to point out. It wasn't like they found these preserved skeletons, which is sort of how you hear the story, that he was putting his victims in these vats of acid and they were coming out just clean skeletons and selling them to medical schools.
I think that he, as you said, he built this place with the intention of nefarious deeds, or at the very least, getting away with his other crimes of, fraud, of this or that.
It could have just been a way for him to sneak out of the building, for all we know.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what the hotel, and I also should point out that we have really very little evidence that it ever was a fully operating hotel.
The bottom level apparently was just sort of retail.
Yeah, there was a pharmacy.
I heard someone describe it as what would have been considered like a strip mall. Like they had like a pharmacy and a candy store, jewelry counter.
I'll say this, certainly he was not so worried about people discovering his, nefarious murder hotel when he set the third floor on fire to try and collect he committed arson to try and collect insurance. And obviously, if you're trying to hide your, cattle chutes and crematoriums and whatever else that you're throwing in there, you're maybe not going to want to have people come investigate the building when you've committed arson as a fraudulent way to collect the fire.
Yeah, it's not a very inconspicuous thing to do.
Exactly.
Right. And because there's so much, even now, that is disputed or unknown, unproven, I think what happens is very often at that time in history, it becomes a game of telephone. 3 different newspapers later, all poaching from the same story that they read, it becomes a much bigger story than perhaps it was.
That's what happened, is that you'd have a newspaper in Chicago reporting one thing that the reporter had seen on the ground, and then a newspaper in Philadelphia needs a story to print because he went on trial in Philadelphia. So they get their information from this report that is, maybe a third hand, second hand that's gone through an editor, and then that's being printed. And then in New Hampshire, where he's from, they're printing an even more sensational account of that.
It arrives in this day. Because there was a book written about him in 1940 that sourced a lot of those tabloids. But it was a book that was used as a source by Larson. And so Devil in the White City, uses as its source this book from not only its only source, but one of its sources, this book written in 1940 that used as its sources
the tabloid
completely unreliable tabloid journalism of the time.
It's like, there's that scene in Citizen Kane where he's just started the newspaper and they're talking about, there's some story about, oh, so-and-so, the neighbor woman is missing and she's probably murdered. Like, where did you get that from? Like, he made it up because it was gonna sell more papers.
But there are some things that took place, we related to Holmes around his murder castle that do point to him being a murderer. Now, he confessed to 27 murders, has been sort of whittled down to 9 confirmed murders. There are a number of strange things in the hotel. Again, there's chutes, there are hallways to nowhere, there's a soundproof vault. And I was listening to a podcast about Holmes that just sort of asked the question, why do you need a soundproof vault? And Holmes had confirmed it at some sort of a party gathering that this vault was soundproof. Like, hey, look at this cool party trick. You can't hear them scream. Like, that's weird. It's weird and we know it's weird. Now, what do you guys, so let's talk about the people that disappeared or the confirmed murders. What do you know about this?
1 or 2 of them actually happened in the murder castle. The others were, on the road, really.
So it's Minnie Williams.
Right, and her sister.
And her sister, that he had some sort of an affair with Minnie Williams. He said that potentially a backroom abortion gone wrong, she died, and then some people have surmised that he maybe poisoned her daughter, or was it daughter, sister?
Pearl is the daughter.
Pearl is the daughter.
Yes.
And then, now, Peitzel was a business associate, and the 2 of them were going to run an insurance scam involving a cadaver, but instead he killed Peitzel and used Peitzel's body for the insurance collection.
Yeah, H.H. Holmes had a number of different lackeys that he worked with over the years that sort of covered up for his shady dealings and that would assume aliases to help out Holmes as well. One of these individuals was Robert Peitzel, who would become his most prominent, notorious accomplice. And I will say he will definitely be a character in the Scorsese movie. So they were working on a scheme that would wind up with someone faking the death, and Holmes pitched to Peitzel, how about you fake your death and then we'll collect and split the money, and then he just killed Peitzel.
Right, and he also had a shady lawyer that had been a referral from a guy that he met in prison, and yeah, the 3 of them were gonna split the money on this. But Peitzel didn't realize that he was going to be the corpse in this situation.
And it is around this time that the walls start closing in on Holmes. So he's gotten away with a number of just disappearances, shady dealings around his hotel where he's been stealing furniture and not paying people back for their work on the hotel.
And that was actually another thing that all the secret compartments were good for. He would hide the furniture, so if they tried to come repossess it, they couldn't see
he'd
it.
wallpaper over a door. I mean, the whole thing is really creepy, but you can't murder furniture. And so he was doing all these.
I've tried.
And so he's doing all these shady dealings. The walls start closing in on him, but it's really, it reaches this fever pitch when it comes to Peitzel, and this scheme just gets totally out of hand.
So Peitzel gets murdered for this insurance scam, and then somehow Holmes takes custody of all of Peitzel's children except for like a baby and the oldest daughter who stay with Peitzel's wife. And then Holmes goes on the road with these kids, and then he put the two of them in a trunk, drilled a hole in and put it in a gas pipe. And then I believe removed their feet because one of them had a club foot and he thought it would make the bodies harder to identify.
Meanwhile, while this is happening, he has a wife who is none the wiser to any of this shit. Like the fact that he was able to maintain a what we can assume to be a healthy, committed relationship. I mean, it wasn't healthy.
Well, he was a bigamist at this point already too, so you know.
But that she had no idea that all this stuff was going on. But he's leaving a trail. He's leaving some pretty heavy breadcrumbs, and eventually on November 17th, 1884, he would be arrested, although not for what you would think. Stay with us in part 3 because we're gonna be telling you about what he started talking about while he was arrested and a little bit more about the legacy of H.H. Holmes and his death.